Welcome back for the third and final installment in our Haunted Royals mini-series. Links to part 1 and 2 are in the description. In this all-female video are 5 royals from history who are still hanging around. So let's find out what haunting tales our research has uncovered. The historical footprint of Empress Matilda, often known as Maud, is one of the most dramatic in English history. Her life was defined by a brutal 19-year civil war called the Anarchy, a series of impossible escapes, and a struggle for a crown that was rightfully hers. History books remember her as a fierce and sometimes abrasive leader. Local folklore and paranormal reports have turned her into something else entirely, a persistent, ghostly figure who still haunts the castles and abbeys that saw her greatest trials. These stories are not just bits of local gossip, they are deeply tied to the historical trauma and triumphs of the 12th century. To understand why Matilda's ghost is so widely reported, it is necessary to look at the woman behind the legend. Matilda was born on the 7th of February 1102, the daughter of Henry I and his first wife Matilda of Scotland. At the age of 8, she was betrothed to Henry V, and in 1114 she married him. The death of Matilda's brother on the 25th November 1120, in the White Ship disaster, made her Henry's sole legitimate heir. When her husband died in 1125, Henry recalled her to England and insisted that the nobles accept her as his successor. In 1128, she married Geoffrey of Anjou, with whom she had 3 sons. A woman ruler was unprecedented, and her marriage to Geoffrey was unpopular. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, immediately had himself crowned king. Oxford Castle is arguably the most haunted place associated with Matilda. In 2009, she was reportedly named the most seen ghost in Britain. The sightings there are almost always tied to the winter of 1142, when she was trapped inside the castle by Stephen's army. For 3 months, the king's forces tried to starve her out, but Matilda pulled off what many call the greatest escape in English history. One of the most famous modern reports came from a security guard who was patrolling the grounds at night with his dog. The dog suddenly stopped and began growling at something invisible, eventually backing away in terror. Moments later, 2 large shadowy figures appeared, and the guard was so frightened he ran away. Most disturbingly, the dog reportedly died just a few days later, leading to local claims that the animal was literally frightened to death by the paranormal encounter. In April 2025, an eerie photograph taken by a tourist in 2009 resurfaced and went viral on Reddit. The image, taken by Louis Jones in St. George's Tower, appears to show a cloaked figure in a white dress standing in a doorway. Jones claimed that he and his cousin had been in the room moments before, and it was completely empty. The manager of the castle, Adam Makinson, noted that the site is one of the most haunted in the UK, and that the photograph matches artist depictions of Matilda's escape perfectly. While Oxford is known for the snowy flight, Devizes Castle in Wiltshire is associated with an even more horrific folklore story. In 1141, after the rout of Winchester, Matilda found herself trapped at Devizes. To escape Stephen, she reportedly had herself wrapped in funeral linens. Disguised as a corpse, she was carried out of the castle and transported nearly 60 miles away. This deathly association has coloured the paranormal reports of the castle for centuries. A lady in white is frequently seen, and while some identify her as Isabella of Valois, who was supposedly buried alive in the walls, others believe the spirit is actually Matilda, forever reliving the moment she had to die to survive. The stories of Matilda's spirit aren't limited to England. Across the Channel in Normandy, at Abbaye de Mortemer, she is a central figure in local ghost lore. The abbey was built in 1134 on swampland, which gave it the name Mortemer, or Dead Sea. Matilda was a major supporter of the abbey, and local legend claims she was forced by her father to stay there for 5 years. The most unique piece of folklore associated with Matilda at Mortemer involves a pair of gloves. She is known locally as the White Lady and is said to walk by the ancient pools. Witnesses are warned to look away if they see her, but if they do look, the gloves she wears tell their future. Arundel Castle in West Sussex was the site of Matilda's first major military move. In 1139, She landed there with 140 knights and was hosted by her stepmother, Queen Adeliza. Stephen quickly surrounded the castle, and while Matilda eventually escaped to Bristol, her presence left a lasting haunted reputation at the site. The castle is reported to have at least 7 distinct ghosts, including a blue man in the library who is seen searching through books, and a small boy who scurries around the kitchen. While Matilda herself is not the only white lady seen at Arundel, there is a legend of a girl who jumped from Hyorn's tower after a heartbreak. The general atmosphere of the castle is defined by the dynastic drama she brought with her. The most chilling omen at Arundel is the white bird. This apparition is said to appear and flutter against the castle windows whenever a member of the resident Howard family, the Dukes of Norfolk, is about to die. This matches the theme of spectral warnings that seems to follow Matilda's history, much like the gloved lady of Mortemer. Reading Abbey was a place of great spiritual importance to Matilda. Her father, Henry I, founded it and was buried there in front of the high altar in 1136. Matilda visited the abbey in 1141 and presented the monks with one of the most famous relics of the Middle Ages, the hand of St. James. This mummified hand was said to have miraculous healing powers and was kept in a gold reliquary encrusted with jewels. Empress Matilda was a woman who refused to give up, even when she was outnumbered, trapped, and told that a woman could not rule. Her ghost is a perfect reflection of that life. Whether she is appearing in an off-limits area of a prison to frighten a guard or foretelling a death at a ruined abbey in France, the stories all centre on her refusal to be forgotten. The memory of Elizabeth I is etched so deeply into the stones of England's old palaces that many believe she never truly left them. For over 400 years, stories of a woman in a black gown have filtered out of places like Windsor Castle and the Tower of London. These are not just tall tales told to scare tourists. They are accounts recorded by soldiers, library staff, and even the kings and queens who followed her. Understanding the ghost of Elizabeth requires looking at her life, the weird ways she died, and the strange beliefs of the people she ruled. The average person in Elizabethan England lived in a world where magic was everywhere. If a cow went dry or a harvest failed, it was not just bad luck, it was likely the work of a witch. Elizabeth herself took this seriously enough to pass a law in 1562 called an Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments, and Witchcrafts, which meant you could be executed if your magic hurt someone. While the common folk were putting witch jars filled with pins and urine under their doorsteps to keep spirits away, the Queen herself was meeting with John Dee, who was her personal occultist and alchemist and helped her pick the best dates for important events based on the stars. This mix of high-level politics and deep superstition created a culture where it was perfectly normal to believe a powerful person's spirit might stick around after they died. The people of that time were constantly looking for ways to ward off evil. They believed the devil was a real person who could show up at any time. If you sneezed and no one said, "God bless you," you were in trouble because the devil could jump right into your mouth. They also had a very different view of fairies than we do today. Back then, fairies were thought to be mean, tricky creatures that were often linked to the devil. Families would ring church bells when a baby was born, just to scare off any fairies that might try to swap the infant for a changeling. If you want to find the ghost of Elizabeth, most people will tell you to go to Windsor Castle. It is often called the most haunted royal home in the world, with at least 25 different ghosts being reported over the years. Elizabeth is the most famous of them all, and she seems to have a very specific routine. We do have a video on the channel about the 25 ghosts of Windsor Castle. I will link it at the end of this video and in the description. The most common place to see her is the Royal Library. The story is almost always the same. First, people hear the sound of high heels clicking on the bare floorboards. Then they see a striking presence of a woman in a black gown with a black shawl over her shoulders. She usually walks through the library and disappears into an inner room. One of the most detailed accounts came from a man named Lieutenant Carr Glynn in February 1897. He was sitting in the library when a lady dressed in black walked right past him. He thought she looked exactly like the portraits of Elizabeth I that he had seen on the walls. He followed her around a corner, but she had vanished. There were no doors she could have used, and a castle attendant told him that he was the only person who had even been in the library that whole afternoon. The staff there didn't seem surprised. They just told him he'd been lucky enough to get a special audience with the Queen. What makes these stories stand out is that they aren't just coming from outsiders. Several kings and queens have claimed to see Elizabeth at Windsor. King George III. He claimed he actually spoke to a ghostly woman in a black dress in the library. She told him she was married to England. King Edward VII. He told one of his mistresses about a time he saw a woman in black who looked just like the Tudor Queen. King George VI. The father of the late Queen Elizabeth II reported seeing the ghost 8 nights in a row, right at the start of World War II. Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, both sisters, reportedly saw paranormal things in the castle when they were younger and believed it was their ancestor. The stories of Elizabeth being haunted actually started while she was still alive. Her final days at Richmond Palace in March 1603 were full of omens that would make any person's blood run cold. One of the most famous stories from her deathbed comes from a lady-in-waiting named Elizabeth Southwell. She wrote that another lady, Elizabeth Guildford, left the Queen sleeping in her room to go into another part of the palace. While walking through the hallways, she saw the Queen walking right in front of her. Lady Guildford was scared because she thought the Queen had gotten out of bed and would be mad that she was left alone. But when she stepped forward to talk to her, the figure just disappeared. When she ran back to the bedroom, the Queen was still there, fast asleep. In folklore, seeing a double of a living person is called a fetch, and it was always seen as a sign that they were about to die. There were other spooky things happening too. 2 ladies-in-waiting found a Queen of Hearts playing card in the bottom of Elizabeth's chair with an iron nail driven right through its forehead. They were too scared to pull it out because they thought it was a curse or a piece of witchcraft. Elizabeth herself was acting very strange. She was deeply sad after many of her friends died, and she felt guilty about executing her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. She refused to go to bed because she was terrified that if she lay down, she would never get up again. She stayed standing up for 15 hours straight without help, and then sat on cushions on the floor for 4 days, hardly saying a word. She told one of her advisors, "I am tied with a chain of iron about my neck." When she finally lost the ability to speak, she had to use hand gestures, like drawing a circle around her head, to show that she wanted James VI of Scotland to be the next king. Hatfield House is another place where the spirit of Elizabeth I is said to linger. This was her childhood home, and she was sitting under an oak tree in the gardens when she found out her sister Mary had died, and she was now queen. In January 1951, 2 young women visiting the house reported a strange encounter. They were in the long gallery when they saw what looked like a wax model of Queen Elizabeth standing at the far end of the room. As they walked toward it to get a better look, the figure simply disappeared. The curator of the house at the time believed they were telling the truth, and said the whole house felt full of her spirit. Some people are skeptical about this haunting because the current Hatfield house wasn't even built until 1611, 8 years after Elizabeth died. Skeptics say if she were to haunt anywhere at Hatfield, it would be the old palace nearby, where she actually lived. However, the house still keeps many of her things, including the rainbow portrait, and visitors still report hearing faint laughter and seeing shadowy shapes in the gallery. Even today, people working at royal residences have stories that are hard to explain. A former library worker at Windsor shared a story from 1992 about working late in the archive rooms. She turned around to find a woman in an old-fashioned gown with red hair just standing in the doorway. She said the woman looked completely real, not see-through at all, but then she just walked backward into the wall and was gone. The ghost stories of Elizabeth I tell us a lot about how we view power and history. In the centuries after she died, she became more than just a person. She became a symbol of England's greatness. The fact that people still see her ghost suggests that her influence was so strong that it couldn't be contained in just one lifetime. Some researchers think these stories survive because they turn history into something you can actually experience. Standing in the Windsor Library and hearing the sound of high heels makes the 1500s feel real in a way that reading a book never could. These stories also give a voice to the buildings themselves, making them feel like they are still connected to the people who built them. Mary Beatrice d'Este, known to history as Mary of Modena, is a strange mix of high-stakes politics and lingering ghost stories. As the second wife of King James II and VII, she was the last Catholic queen consort of England, Scotland, and Ireland, a position that made her a target for some of the most vicious rumours and enduring folklore in British history. Her life was a series of dramatic shifts, moving from the refined courts of Italy to a London filled with religious paranoia, and eventually to a long, mournful exile in France. To understand the spooky stories and paranormal reports associated with her, one has to look at the atmosphere of the time. The late 17th century was a period where fake news wasn't just a modern term, it was a weapon used to unseat a king, and Mary was right at the centre of it. Before getting into the external ghost sightings, it is important to look at what many historians and folklorists call the internal haunting of Mary of Modena's life. Between 1674 and 1688, Mary went through 10 pregnancies. Most of these ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or the deaths of infants only a few months old. In a royal court, where the only job of a queen was to provide a healthy male heir, this repeated tragedy was not just a personal sorrow, it became a public spectacle and a source of superstitious dread among the population. The psychological toll on Mary was massive. After the death of her daughter Isabella in 1681, a child who had lived for nearly 5 years and was the light of the Queen's life, Mary reportedly fell into a state of religious mania. Her withdrawal into deep prayer and her physical fragility led to rumours that the Stuart line was cursed or that her Catholic faith had brought a dark cloud over the palace. The sheer density of death within the royal apartments at St. James's Palace and Whitehall provided a grim foundation for the ghost stories that would follow in later centuries. When visitors today speak of cold spots or the feeling of an unseen presence in these historical rooms, they are often standing in places where these very real tragedies unfolded. At St. James's Palace, reports are tied directly to the rooms where Mary lived. The most famous and most graphic ghost report involves a valet named Joseph Sellis. In 1810, he was found in his room with his throat cut so deeply, his head was nearly off. While this happened after Mary's time, it took place in the exact state apartments where she once stayed and where her most controversial moments occurred. Visitors and staff have reported seeing a shadowy man wandering the halls. Most unsettling are the reports of a figure propped up in a bed with his mouth open and his head lolling over a wide, slashed wound in his neck. People often report a sudden, metallic smell of fresh blood in the corridors. Staff have also complained of chilly spots and the constant, heavy feeling of being watched by someone unseen. Items in these rooms have been known to move on their own, disappearing from one spot and reappearing in another. At Hardwicke Hall, there is a specific paranormal report centered on a rare portrait of Mary of Modena. Unlike the glamorous paintings of her youth, this one shows her in her later years, looking bitter and sour. Visitors frequently report feeling an overwhelming wave of sadness when standing in front of the painting. Some claim the air near the portrait feels heavy, as if the Queen's later years of bitterness and the sorrow of losing her children and her crown have been imprinted onto the canvas itself. The Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh is famous for its overlapping ghost stories. Because Mary of Modena lived in a suite of rooms identical to those of Mary, Queen of Scots, local folklore often blends their spirits together. There are recurring reports of a Catholic queen seen praying intensely in the private chapel or walking through the gardens at night. While many assume it is the 16th century Mary, the physical descriptions, tall, Italian features, and deeply pious, often match Mary of Modena more closely. Tourists visiting the Queen's bed in the tower often report unsettling feelings or cold drafts, This 17th century bed was actually used by Mary of Modena, and it remains a focal point for spooky sensations in the palace. The most enduring piece of spooky folklore associated with Mary is the legend of the warming pan. When she gave birth to a healthy son in 1688, the rumour mill didn't just claim he was a fraud, it framed the event as a changeling story, a type of dark folklore where a real child is replaced by a supernatural or commoner substitute. Legend says the fake baby was smuggled into the Queen's bed via the back stairs at St. James's Palace inside a brass warming pan. To this day, ghost hunters often focus on these back stairs as a site of residual energy, claiming to hear the whispers of the conspirators and the clink of the brass pan. In a strange twist of modern folklore, Mary of Modena's name is frequently linked to the hauntings of the RMS Queen Mary in California. While the ship was named for a different queen, the name itself has become a ghost magnet for Stuart-related themes. The ship's most famous ghost is a woman in an elegant white gown seen waltzing in the salon. This sighting mirrors the old European white lady folklore, a royal spirit that appears to foretell tragedy. A legend Mary would have known well from her own family history. The ghost of a young girl named Jackie is often heard giggling near the pool. Because Mary of Modena lost 10 children to stillbirths and infant deaths, many paranormal researchers draw a folkloric link between the historical queen's nursery tragedies and the child spirits seen on the ship. The ghost of Mary of Modena isn't just one single sighting, but a collection of unresolved energy found in the places where she suffered her greatest losses. From the metallic smell of blood at St. James's to the mournful eyes of her portrait at Hardwicke Hall, her paranormal legacy is built on the weight of her grief and the incredible legends that people have told about her for over 300 years. For anyone visiting these sites today, the Stuart shadow remains a very real part of the atmosphere. Princess Sophia was born into a world of gold and silk, yet her life is remembered as a long struggle against loneliness and tight control. As the 12th child and 5th daughter of King George III and Queen Charlotte, she spent her days in a household so strict that she and her sisters called it a nunnery. This feeling of being trapped did not leave her even after she died at Kensington Palace on the 27th of May 1848. Today, her name is tied to some of the most famous ghost stories in the British royal residences. People say they hear her old spinning wheel creaking in the middle of the night, or see an elderly woman in an old-fashioned gown walking through the rooms where she lived out her final blind years. These stories are not just scary tales. They are rooted in the very real sadness of a woman who was never allowed to live the life she wanted. To understand why Sophia is said to haunt Kensington Palace, we have to look at the world she was born into. She came into the world on the 3rd of November, 1777, at Buckingham House, which we now know as Buckingham Palace. Her father, George III, was a man who loved his daughters very much, but his love was often stifling. He was a king who lost his mind several times, and his illness made him cling to his children even more. Her mother, Queen Charlotte, was even stricter. She wanted her daughters to stay by her side forever, acting as companions and servants, rather than living their own lives as wives and mothers. Princess Sophia is one of the most famous permanent residents of Kensington Palace. While she died in 1848, many people believe she never truly left the rooms where she spent her final lonely years. Today, her ghost is at the centre of some of the most chilling stories in royal history. These tales range from the rhythmic whirring of an invisible spinning wheel to sightings of a faceless woman in an old-fashioned gown walking through solid walls. The most detailed sighting of Princess Sophia's ghost happened in the 1970s in apartment 1A, the same area where the Prince and Princess of Wales lived with their children. A housekeeper known as Mrs. Mack was working in the entrance hall when she suddenly felt the hair on her neck stand up, as if someone was staring directly at her. When she turned around, she saw a woman standing in the doorway of the drawing room. The figure was wearing a distinctive, high-waisted Regency-style gown from the early 1800s. The most terrifying part of the encounter was that the woman had no visible face. As the housekeeper watched, the figure simply turned and walked straight through a solid wall. This wasn't the only scare the staff had during that time. One night, the housekeeper and a butler were jolted awake by a dreadful scream that echoed through the empty palace. Yet when they searched the building, they found absolutely nothing. If you talk to the staff at Kensington Palace today, the story you hear most often isn't about a visual ghost, but a sound. For decades, security guards and cleaners have reported hearing a mechanical creaking coming from empty rooms late at night. It is the unmistakable sound of a spinning wheel. In her youth, Sophia was a talented seamstress, and using a spinning wheel was one of the few ways she was allowed to pass the time while trapped in her mother's strict household. When she went blind in her later years, she had to give up the hobby entirely. Ghost hunters believe the sound is a residual haunting, an echo of a repetitive action she performed for hours every day. Some people have even claimed to see an elderly, sad-looking woman sitting in the shadows, her hands moving as if she is still spinning wool that isn't there. The Royal Nursery in Apartment 1A is considered a major hotspot for paranormal activity. It's common for people to report a heavy, unsettling atmosphere in this room. Biographers and staff have described sightings of multiple ghosts appearing here together. Princess Sophia is often seen roaming the nursery alongside other famous spirits, including King George II and Caroline of Brunswick. Witnesses say these figures appear as solid, lifelike people who suddenly vanish through the nursery walls. This specific room is so notorious that some staff members have reportedly been reluctant to work in it alone after dark. Many believe Sophia's ghost remains restless because of the heavy secrets she carried in life. The most famous bit of folklore involves a secret pregnancy in 1800. To hide the birth from her father, King George III, the family claimed she was suffering from dropsy, swelling, and was miraculously cured by eating roast beef and sea bathing. The child, a boy named Tommy Garth, became a major source of trauma for Sophia. In 1828, a spooky piece of evidence appeared, an iron box full of letters proving Sophia was his mother. Tommy used this box to blackmail the royal family for £30,000. This scandal, combined with the fact that Sophia was blind and being spied on by courtiers like Sir John Conroy, created a life of intense stress and fear. Folklore suggests that this unresolved pain is what keeps her spirit tethered to the palace. The historical identity of Mary I, the undisputed Queen Regnant of England, has undergone a radical transformation over nearly 5 centuries. While her reign lasted a mere 5 years, from 1553 to 1558, the psychological and cultural impact of her life has generated a vast body of folklore and paranormal reports that persist into the present day. Known to popular history as Bloody Mary, a nickname born of propaganda and the execution of nearly 300 religious dissenters, her identity has shifted from a historical sovereign into a global supernatural myth. The transformation of Mary Tudor's reputation began almost immediately after her death. The overwhelming success of John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, first published in 1563, was instrumental in this process. By writing the stories of those burned at the stake during her reign, Foxe turned the Queen into a paranoid, desperate figure of terror. The paranormal reports associated with Mary I are deeply tied to the extreme instability of her early life. She went from being the beloved heir to an illegitimate outcast following the annulment of her parents' marriage. Forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her half-sister Elizabeth and denied access to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, even as the elder woman lay dying, Mary developed a rigid adherence to her faith as a form of survival. These traumatic years are believed to have left an emotional imprint on the buildings she inhabited, particularly Hampton Court and St. James's Palace. Sawston Hall in Cambridgeshire holds one of the few positive ghost stories associated with Mary I. In July 1553, Mary was a fugitive fleeing the forces of the Duke of Northumberland. She found refuge at Sawston Hall, the home of the loyal Huddleston family. As she escaped the hall, disguised as a milkmaid, riding pillion behind a groom, she looked back from a nearby hill to see the building being torched by Northumberland's soldiers. She famously told Sir John Huddleston, "Let it blaze. When I am queen, I will build the Huddlestons a better house." True to her word, she provided stone from Cambridge Castle for the rebuilding of the hall in the late 1550s. The hauntings at Sawston Hall are distinct for their auditory nature. In the 1930s, Claire Huddleston, the wife of the hall's owner, reported hearing a spinet being played in empty rooms. Although the house had a harpsichord, she insisted the sound was that of a spinet, an instrument Mary was known to play expertly since the age of 2. Other visitors have reported seeing a ghostly apparition of the Queen herself roaming the tapestry room, where she spent her final restless night before her escape. St. James's Palace served as Mary's primary residence in her final years and was the location of her death on the 17th of November, 1558. In accordance with the traditions of the time, her heart was removed and buried separately from her body. It rests beneath the choir stalls in the Chapel Royal of St. James's. The palace is generally closed to the public, which has led to a more private, internal tradition of ghost stories among the staff. Historical records from one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting describe the Queen leaving the palace at night with just a few attendants to visit the surrounding neighbourhoods in disguise. One story recounts her visiting the home of a shoemaker to ask why he hadn't been paid by the Royal Exchequer. These nocturnal walkabouts have given rise to modern reports of a small group of women in Tudor dress seen walking the streets of St. James's after dark, only to suddenly vanish. The most widespread spooky story associated with Mary is the mirror summoning ritual. While many people believe they are calling upon the Tudor Queen, historians and folklorists found that the ritual, as it is known today, only began to come about in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The legend typically involves standing in a darkened room, usually a bathroom because they lack windows, and chanting Bloody Mary a specific number of times into a mirror. The reported results of the summoning vary. Some claim the ghost appears and screams, while others report physical attacks, such as scratches on the face or arms. Some darker versions involve the participant chanting, "I killed your baby, Bloody Mary," a direct reference to the Queen's tragic pregnancies. In another version, the participant must walk backward up a flight of stairs, holding a candle and a mirror. Seeing a man's face meant a future husband, while seeing a skull meant death before marriage. The nursery rhyme Mary, Mary, quite contrary, is often cited in folklore as a coded history of Mary I's reign. While many historians view this as a later interpretation, the symbolic associations are now a permanent part of the Bloody Mary myth. The garden in the rhyme is interpreted as the graveyards filled with the Protestants she executed, while the silver bells and cockleshells are alleged to be instruments of torture. The pretty maids, all in a row, are said to represent guillotines or rows of those executed, though the guillotine was not actually used in Tudor England. The spectral legacy of Mary I is a testament to how trauma and propaganda can transform a historical figure into a lasting cultural nightmare. In life, Mary was a woman of deep faith who was broken by the political secret plans of her father and the failure of her own body. In death, she has been denied the quiet grave she requested, placed instead beneath the sister who dismantled her life's work.